Believe he's innocent. You just have to not be convinced he's guilty. So when it comes down to it, at the end of the trial, when you've got everything in front of you, and you go into the jury room, and you're talking to your peers about this, and you're saying, what do we think about this? What do I think about this? Okay. You start looking at it, and what you're trying to determine is, do I believe the claim that the prosecution is making that the defendant is guilty of this charge? And the fact is, if we come down on, you know what, I just don't know if he's guilty or not, well, then you got to find not guilty. That's the instruction. Yeah. Because basically you're saying, I can't commit to the claim that he's guilty as being correct because I just can't determine that. It's not that you can't determine whether he's guilty or not guilty. You can't determine that he's guilty, so you have to find not guilty. There is no in-between. You either think he's guilty or you don't think he's guilty. That does not mean you think he's innocent. I can believe that the person might have done it, but then believe also that it just has not been shown by the evidence. And so therefore I can say, you know what, man, that son of a gun just looks guilty to me. I just feel like he's guilty. But not guilty by a preponderance of the evidence and not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And they sure haven't proven that case in a court of law. So I can't say that they've shown that he's guilty. No matter how I feel about it, it's just not shown, and I can't say that I believe he's guilty based on what they're presenting. And that's what it comes down to, is the idea of there's a claim there that says a God exists. And you either believe that claim, in which case you're a theist, because there is theism, belief in God, and you have that belief, and so you are a theist, one who believes a God exists. And if you're not a theist, if you don't believe that God exists, if you're saying, I don't know what I believe, well, then you're not convinced. You're not believing it. So you are then without belief in God. Until you get convinced, you are without belief in God. You are without theism, belief in God. You are an atheist, one who does not believe a God exists.
See, I wanted to actually draw up a couple of graphs to actually demonstrate all this, but we didn't get time. I need to make one correction real quick about the April lecture. Mark actually called in to remind us. The April lecture is Dr. Charles Jackson, and the subject is what geology can tell us about long-term changes to the climate. So another good science-based lecture at the Austin History Center, first ending in April. When we were talking about this kind of, the whole reason this subject came up, first of all, I'm a geek for epistemology, so figuring out what we know or don't know, or if there is any such thing that we know and why, going through the steps of determining what belief is and to what degrees, I enjoy that. But Tracie and I were discussing the definitions or labels of agnosticism and atheism. To kind of expand on your courtroom analogy is, a lot of times when we're discussing, if you were discussing somebody's guilt, the people who say, I don't know whether or not he's guilty, cannot fall into the guilty side. That's what you were explaining. It's you either believe this or you don't. So if you imagine that this section is guilty, and you may believe it to varying degrees of certainty, you may be nearly absolutely convinced of their guilt, but you have to, as long as you believe it, you're on this side. Everything on this side becomes not guilty.
Not belief, right?
But there's a negation of the claim, which is innocence. And if you were to set that over on this side, there would be people who they're still in the not guilty category. They're still on this side, but there would be people who also believe that the defendant is actually innocent and to some degree of certainty. You can do this exact same thing when we're talking about the issue of the existence of God. There are theists who believe to varying degrees of certainty. Everybody on this side is an atheist. And then there is this other definition, or this smaller classification, who actively believe that no God exists. And that would qualify as strong atheism, although we don't generally get into kind of dividing it. So if you imagine those three sections, when we're talking about what is your position or what is your belief with regard to the existence of God, the theist is definitely over here. The atheist is somewhere over here. The strong atheist being in small category. Where's the agnostic? Well, what have they actually told us? Maybe they've told us they don't know what they believe, so they don't know where they are in the scale.
But they know they're not there.
But which means they can't possibly be on the belief side, because they don't know what their position is between these two. So they're automatically on the atheist side, just by virtue of not knowing. If they're making a claim about what their position is on knowledge, they've avoided answering the question entirely. Because now what they've said is, I'm not in these two little narrow bands at either end. They think they're in this middle section. They think that they've found the pathway to an intellectual happy middle ground, and they're wrong. They're on this side for sure, but if they just say they're agnostic, in reality, they're on, and they don't address what their belief is, they're everything within the bounds of what we qualify as knowledge, because you can be an agnostic theist or an agnostic atheist. All you're saying is, I don't know, whether it's absolute certainty or your variable certainty that we talked about earlier. So they haven't answered the question at all. They haven't told us what their position is.
Right.
And that's why, like absolute certainty and in the sense of knowledge, I tend to find agnostic, when you're talking about the issue, does a God exist? And somebody says, I'm agnostic. Well, thank you for telling me absolutely nothing. You've told me either you don't know what your belief is, or you don't accept the idea of knowledge, neither of which relates to the question that I asked, and neither of which provides anything productive to the discussion. To tell me you're an agnostic means nothing. There is the alternate kind of man on the street definition, where they're trying to claim this middle ground. The problem is that they don't view it as this middle ground between belief that there is a... They think that it's belief that there is a God versus belief that there's no God. They're trying to claim that they're in the middle ground on this very fine point, that they actually have no position at all, which is impossible. Because theism, or the belief, or the acceptance of guilt in the courtroom example, is something that you must possess, and anything short, including doubt or confusion or not understanding the claim very well, puts you on the side where you're not believing. And that's kind of what we were getting to in the discussion.